I remember that night in San Francisco as if it happened yesterday, though I wish I could erase it from my memory. Madison's birthday party was held in her sleek townhouse near Nob Hill, a place Gregory and Carolyn had bragged about helping her secure, though a good portion of that help had quietly come from me over the years. The doorman at the entrance looked me over as if I were some stranger off the street, and for the first time in my life I had to pull out my driver's license to prove I belonged in a building where my own money had laid some of the bricks. That tiny humiliation should have been the first sign of what was coming, but I brushed it aside, clutching the small gift I had prepared with more care and love than anything I'd bought in years. My hands trembled slightly, not just from arthritis, but from anticipation, because I had hidden something precious in that little bundle of yarn and thread. Something meant to say, "You matter to me more than appearances." The townhouse was buzzing with the kind of laughter that feels rehearsed, full of champagne bubbles and perfume that hit me like a wall as soon as I stepped through the door. Gregory's voice floated above the chatter, flat and dismissive. "Mom's here." He didn't even look up from his phone, just announced my arrival as though he were noting the time or the weather. Carolyn was draped across a white leather couch, chatting with a woman whose face I half recognized from a magazine article about power couples of Silicon Valley. Everywhere I looked were designer dresses, polished shoes, expensive watches that caught the light, and not a single glance that softened when it landed on me. My heart sank a little, but I straightened my shoulders, trying to remind myself that I belonged there, not because of their approval, but because I had poured decades of myself into this family. When the moment for presents came, I stepped forward, holding out the small box wrapped in simple paper from a little stationery shop I'd chosen carefully. Years ago, Madison had worked in a similar shop during college, proud to show me her tiny employee discount and laughing as she picked out wrapping paper for my birthday. I remembered that girl, earnest and bright-eyed, when I tied the ribbon around her gift. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that she might remember too. Instead, she peeled back the paper with manicured fingers, her diamond tennis bracelet, a gift from Nathaniel, catching the light in a way that made my humble offering look almost comical in comparison. She lifted the knitted dolls from the box, dangling them between two fingers as though they were contaminated. And with a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she laughed, "This handmade gift looks so cheap." The sound of her laughter sliced through me sharper than any knife. It wasn't just her voice. It was the way the room erupted with it. Gregory's laugh was too loud, like a bark meant to show loyalty. Carolyn's tittering blended with the snorts of Nathaniel's friends. For a moment I stood frozen, cheeks burning, clutching the edge of the table to steady myself because my knees threatened to give way. No one noticed the hours I had spent knitting through pain. No one saw the diamond hidden carefully inside the heart of one doll, the diamond my late husband James had given me when we celebrated 50 years together. To Madison, it was junk. To the rest of them, it was a punchline. I forced a smile, one I had practiced earlier in the mirror, but inside I felt something crack, something that had been fragile for years, but had somehow held until that very moment. That night, long after the party ended, I sat alone in my kitchen in San Francisco, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, and I could still hear their laughter echoing in my ears. I ran my fingers over my aching joints, remembering how James used to massage them when the pain got bad, and I stared at the keys to my Lake Tahoe home sitting on the counter. That house had been our refuge, our sanctuary, the place where we scattered his ashes by the water's edge. Now Madison had already plastered her wedding invitations with its address, as though it belonged to her. In the small hours of the morning, something inside me hardened. I realized that if they saw me as disposable, maybe it was time I stopped offering myself up so willingly. By dawn, the decision was made. I would sell the house, and with it, the illusion that family always meant love. Carolyn raised her glass with that little flourish she always used when she wanted the room's attention and said, "Madison, honey, start with the smaller gifts." I could feel the shift in the air as Madison's eyes landed on the tiny package in my lap, the one I had carried all the way from my quiet house in San Francisco, wrapped in paper I'd chosen with trembling hands. My heart started pounding so loudly, I thought people might hear it, but I forced myself to stand, smoothing my skirt, and with a smile I had rehearsed in the bathroom mirror that morning, I stepped forward and said softly, "Happy birthday, sweetheart." She reached out, her nails painted a glossy pale pink, the diamond bracelet Nathaniel had given her, sparkling under the chandelier as though to mock the modest box I placed in her palm. Nathaniel leaned against the marble counter on the far side of the room, his expression unreadable, almost clinical, as if he were scanning a prospectus instead of watching a moment between grandmother and granddaughter. Conversations died down, champagne glasses stilled, and for a few breaths the entire room seemed to lean in. Madison peeled back the paper slowly, as though stretching the anticipation, but all I could feel was the raw ache in my fingers, remembering the nights I'd sat knitting under the lamplight, my joints stiff and screaming, but determined to finish something meaningful. Inside were the two dolls, soft and small, their yarn hair carefully stitched, their tiny outfits matched to the colors Madison had gushed about for her wedding. They weren't perfect, but they carried hours of love, and hidden deep in the heart of one was the diamond James had given me for our 50th anniversary. She lifted the dolls between two fingers, pinching them like they were contaminated, her cream dress pulling tight across her chest as she leaned back with exaggerated distaste. "This handmade gift looks so cheap," she said, her voice slicing through the quiet like glass breaking. For a split second there was silence, just the sound of ice shifting in someone's glass, and I thought maybe, just maybe, someone would step in, reminder of kindness. But then the laughter started, Carolyn's delicate titter, Gregory's forced bark of a laugh that made my stomach twist, a snort from one of Nathaniel's friends who had been watching like a spectator at a circus. The sound swelled until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking with it. My face burned hot, tears threatening but refusing to fall, and I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself as I tried to hold on to the practiced smile. Madison let out a laugh of her own, high and artificial, the kind you hear in socialite circles, and in that instant, I realized something I had been denying for years. It wasn't just that my gift was dismissed, it was that I was dismissed, reduced to a cheap punchline in a room full of people I had sacrificed everything for. And in that hollow ringing silence inside me, a different kind of clarity settled, one that told me life as I had known it with them had just ended. "Grandma, you know we have a registry at Neiman Marcus, right?" Madison said it with a smirk, her voice floating just loud enough for the whole room to catch it. Nathaniel let out a low snicker, adding, "Perfect for the donation pile," and suddenly the space erupted in laughter. Gregory's laugh was too loud, forced, and sharp. Carolyn's tittering floated like ice clinking in a glass, and Nathaniel's friends doubled over as if they'd just witnessed a comedy act. My cheeks burned hot, the sting rushing up my neck as if I'd been slapped in public, not with a hand, but with something sharper, their ridicule. I opened my mouth, fumbling for words, wanting desperately to explain about the diamond hidden inside, about James's hands on mine when he'd given it to me on our 50th anniversary, about the late nights with yarn digging into my aching fingers, the dolls stitched with love rather than dollars. I started, my voice already trembling, but Gregory's hand landed heavily on my shoulder. "Mother, maybe we should talk about getting you some help with your finances," he cut in smoothly, like he was addressing a jury instead of his own mother. "These little crafts, they show you might have too much time on your hands." His tone carried that practiced blend of pity and superiority that only deepened my shame. I scanned the room, desperate for one face, just one, that didn't mirror the contempt or thinly veiled amusement. And then I saw Joshua. He was standing off to the side with his camera, the strap hanging loose around his neck, his expression soft and wounded. He didn't say a word, but his eyes caught mine and held them, offering me a quiet apology in a room that had just declared me irrelevant. That fleeting kindness nearly shattered me right there on the spot, and I clung to it as though it were a lifeline. I left before the cake was even cut, the echo of their laughter chasing me down the marble steps, out into the cool San Francisco night, where the air smelled of eucalyptus and exhaust, and I felt smaller than I had in years. At home, the only light came from my laptop screen, casting a harsh glow over my kitchen table. An email from Madison sat at the top, full of contracts from florists, caterers, photographers, every bill addressed to me. And there it was in black and white, the wedding venue listed as my Lake Tahoe home, the house James and I had poured ourselves into 40 years ago, the one where we had scattered his ashes along the rocky shoreline. "We've already sent the invitations," Madison wrote. "The designer starts renovations next month, so your old furniture will need to go." My hands trembled as I closed the laptop, something solidifying inside me that hadn't been there before, a hardening where once there had only been softness. By morning, Gregory had texted, "Mom found a wonderful retirement community in Marin. Booked us an appointment next week just to look." I stared at the words until the screen blurred, then deleted the message without answering. Outside my bedroom window, San Francisco's skyline gleamed in the early sun, all those glass towers where people made decisions that changed lives without ever asking permission. Was that all I was now? Another aging problem to be managed, relocated, signed away? My keys to Lake Tahoe sat on the nightstand. I grabbed them, shoved them into my purse, and drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly the joints screamed, but I didn't loosen them until I turned into the long driveway, only to find a sleek black SUV parked where James's old truck used to sit. I pushed the front door open and froze at the sound of voices drifting from the great room. "The wall between the kitchen and dining area can definitely come down," a woman said briskly, the click of her stylus against a tablet punctuating each word. "Mrs. O'Connor won't mind, she's barely here anyway." My chest tightened as I stepped into the doorway, and there they were, Madison, Carolyn, and a woman in designer heels, flipping through renderings on a glowing screen. My kitchen, the place where I'd taught Madison how to stir James's clam chowder when she was 9 years old, standing on a stool so she could reach the pot. My voice came out quieter than I intended, but firm. "Actually," I said, the words slicing through their chatter, "I do mind." I set my purse down on the counter with a thud that startled even me and asked, "Who approved these changes?" My voice sounded calmer than I felt, though my chest was tight and my hands shook. Madison stepped forward all sweetness, her tone dripping with that practiced concern. "Grandma, we talked about this. Remember? Last Christmas? You said we could use the house and make it perfect for this ceremony." I looked straight at her, my words deliberate. "I said you could use it. I never agreed to demolition." Before Madison could answer, the designer chimed in with that condescending smile professionals reserve for people they think are irrelevant. "It's not demolition, Mrs. O'Connor. It's modernization. This property has wonderful bones, but the aesthetic is rather dated. We're thinking clean, minimal, very Instagram-ready." She tapped her tablet to show me images of sterile white walls and glossy fixtures, a vision so foreign to the warm wood and stone James and I had loved. I turned toward the living room window, and the sight of Lake Tahoe shimmering in the late sun almost broke me in two. James and I had saved for a decade to afford that view. It was ours, and suddenly it felt like they were stripping it bare. On the mantel, where a photograph of James and me on our 40th anniversary should have been, there was instead a mood board labeled Hampton's Chic. "Where's my photograph?" I asked quietly. Carolyn glanced around, feigning confusion before saying lightly, "Oh, we packed some of your personal things, just for safekeeping during renovations." That word, renovations, burned in my ears. That night, after they left, I searched the house room by room until I found the boxes shoved into the garage, stacked neatly but coldly labeled Kathleen's things. Inside were James's books, our anniversary album, the photograph from the mantel, even the small knitted dolls Madison had mocked at her party. Tossed in, carelessly, the diamond still hidden inside one of them. I sat on the concrete floor, tears stinging, running my hand over James's handwriting in the margins of his books, realizing how invisible I had become to them. My phone rang and Gregory's voice came smooth and polished, the way it always did when he was trying to corner someone in court. "Mom, about that retirement community tour. It's important we plan for your future. The fees have quite a waiting list. Carolyn and I were thinking, since the Lake Tahoe house will mostly be used for family events anyway, it might make sense to transfer it into a trust. Just for tax purposes, of course." My stomach twisted as I recognized the manipulation in every carefully chosen word. "I need to go," I said, and hung up before he could press further. When I returned to the kitchen, a brochure lay on the table, one I hadn't seen that morning. Seaside Retirement Living, where independence meets assistance. In Carolyn's neat handwriting, one unit's floor plan had been circled with the note, "Perfect for Mom." They were already dividing my life into manageable pieces, and the cruelest part was realizing I had been letting them. The next day, at my checkup, Doctor. Matthews looked at me over his wire-rimmed glasses, his brow furrowing. "Kathleen, your blood pressure is concerning. It's significantly higher than your last visit." I laughed weakly, though nothing about it was funny, and said, "Just some family tension." He set his stethoscope down and leaned forward, his voice gentler than I expected. "At your age, stress isn't just uncomfortable. It's dangerous. I've seen patients your age end up in the hospital after family conflict-triggered cardiac events." His words hung heavy between us, and for the first time I realized this wasn't only about dignity or pride. It was about survival. "Any unusual stress lately?" Dr. Leonard Brooks asked, his tone measured, almost too gentle. I wanted to laugh, because where would I even begin? With my granddaughter humiliating me in front of a room full of strangers? With my own son plotting to control every dollar I've saved? With people I barely knew making plans to tear down the walls of my Lake Tahoe home as if I'd already passed on? Instead, I bit down the truth and managed some family tension. Dr. Brooks slipped his stethoscope from around his neck and set it on the counter. He looked at me the way a man looks when he's already seen the answer. "Kathleen, at your age with your history, stress isn't just uncomfortable. It's dangerous. I've had patients your age end up in the hospital after family conflicts triggered cardiac events." His words clung to the air, heavier than any diagnosis. I thought about James's death, about surviving breast cancer in my 60s, about how many times I'd pulled myself through storms. And now, here I was, asking myself if betrayal from the very people I'd given my life to would be the thing that finally broke me. I straightened in my chair, lifted my chin, and said carefully, "I'm adjusting my approach to certain relationships." That afternoon, I met Norma Wilson, my oldest friend, at a small cafe in Pacific Heights that had been ours for decades. The smell of dark roast coffee wrapped around us, mingling with the sound of clinking china, and the waiter, who had served us since the late 90s, winked as he poured. Norma, widowed young, never remarried, always said men were like desserts. Wonderful treats, but not necessary for survival. She wore that same mischievous smile as I told her everything. Madison's birthday, the laughter, the Lake Tahoe house being treated like a set for someone else's party. My voice shook, and once or twice I had to dab at my eyes with my napkin, But Norma didn't interrupt. She just let me talk. When I described the dolls, how Madison held them like trash, Norma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She lowered it slowly, eyes fixed on mine. "And the diamond?" she asked quietly. My throat tightened as I admitted, "Still inside the doll, as far as I know." They didn't even look closely enough to notice saying it aloud made me ache, because it wasn't just about the stone. It was about love, history, and legacy being tossed aside without thought. Norma placed her utensils down with a deliberate little click and leaned closer across the table, her voice steady. "Kathleen," she said, "this isn't just disrespect. They are maneuvering systematically to control your assets." The words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I stared down at my cooling coffee, watching the cream swirl into patterns that vanished as quickly as they formed. It hit me then. This wasn't about me being old-fashioned or sentimental. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't oversight. It was strategy. My own family wasn't drifting away. They were tightening their circle, making their moves, and I had been standing still while they planned how to manage me out of my own life. "Richard mentioned a family trust," Norma said, her eyes narrowing. "Of course he did. Once everything's in his hands, you'll be living on an allowance from your own money." The words made my stomach twist, not because I hadn't suspected it, but because hearing it spoken aloud stripped me of every excuse I'd been clinging to. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Has he asked for power of attorney yet?" Heat rose to my cheeks as I nodded. 3 times since Christmas, I admitted. Norma's hand covered mine, warm and steady. "Thank God you've held him off." "Kathleen, I've watched you give everything to that family. Your time, your money, even your health. And I have to ask, what exactly are you getting back?" Her question landed like a blow straight to my chest. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first. What was I getting? I thought of Madison's laughter, Gregory's rehearsed tone, Carolyn's little sideways smiles that always carried calculation. Not respect, not gratitude, not even the courtesy of being treated like a person instead of a checkbook. "They're my family," I whispered finally, my voice weaker than I intended. Norma shook her head slowly, her gaze sharp but kind. "No, they're people taking advantage of your gentle nature, and there's a difference." For a moment I felt stripped bare, every justification I had used to protect them crumbling until only the truth remained. On the drive home through San Francisco's hills, I turned onto a side street almost without thinking and parked outside a small neighborhood bank James and I had used for decades. The lobby smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish, and the teller still recognized me, greeting me with a smile that reminded me of a different time. I opened the safe deposit box we'd shared, my hands trembling as I lifted out the birth certificates, our marriage license, and James's collection of rare coins, each carefully wrapped. These were things the family didn't know about, little pockets of history untouched by their grasping hands. Holding them brought me a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the man I had lost, relief that there were still pieces of my life they hadn't managed to claim. That evening, the phone rang. "Grandma, are you okay?" It was Joshua, his voice soft, hesitant. "You left the party so suddenly." The concern in his tone warmed something inside me that had been cold for weeks. "I'm fine, dear. Just tired," I told him, even as my chest tightened with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. For once, someone in that family wasn't calling to take something from me, but to give me the smallest gift, the comfort of being seen. Joshua's voice came in low and careful, the way people talk when they're afraid the truth might tip you over. He said he'd heard Gregory talking about my Lake Tahoe place and asked if they were really planning major renovations, without asking me, and something in my chest eased because at least one person in this family still knew how to ask. "They seem to have a lot of plans I wasn't consulted on," I told him, staring at the keys on my counter like they might answer back. There was a pause, the kind that makes air feel heavier. And then he said, "Grandma, I found something you should see." He sounded older in that moment. Not my sweet boy with the camera always hanging from his neck, but a man standing in a doorway holding a hard truth. Gregory had left papers in the home printer. Financial statements, second mortgage notices, numbers that bled red across the page. I gripped the phone harder until my fingers complained. "What kind of statements?" I asked, even though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Joshua cleared his throat and said, "Investment losses. A lot. And the second mortgage it's not small. I think they might be counting on your assets to bail them out." I opened my laptop and logged into my accounts, the screen's cold light washing over the kitchen. 3 attempted logins from an unrecognized device in the last week blinked at me like a row of warning lights. The room felt suddenly smaller, the old house sounds, the hum of the fridge, the faint rattle of pipes. Too loud, like the place itself was trying to warn me. This wasn't a misunderstanding about decor or a thoughtless venue choice. This was a plan, dressed up as concern to annex my life while calling it love. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back watching headlights slide across the ceiling, replaying Madison's fingers pinching those knitted dolls like they might stain her dress, hearing that little practiced laugh swallow the room whole. I kept thinking about the diamond tucked into the heart of one doll, the one James had reset for our 50th, and how it might have covered the entire wedding if anyone had bothered to look deeper than the surface. The part that kept me awake wasn't the money. It was the realization that I'd spent years hunting for redeeming qualities in people who had stopped looking for them in me. Around 3 a.m, I got up, made tea I didn't drink, and stood at the sink staring out into the dark street, remembering how James would press his palm to my back and say, "You know what's right," and how steady those words always felt. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I took a shower hot enough to steam up the mirror, put on the navy cardigan James used to compliment, and called Alan Fitzgerald, the estate attorney James introduced me to 2 years ago, the one I never thought I'd need. He answered on the second ring, polite surprise in his voice when he heard how quickly I wanted to meet. "This afternoon works," he said, and I could hear him reshuffling his day. I thanked him, then stood in the quiet of my kitchen, hands flat on the cool counter, letting the decision settle into my bones. For months, I had been reacting. To laughter, to plans made without me, to papers shoved under my nose. Calling Alan wasn't a reaction. It was me taking the wheel back. "Bring any financial documents you can," Alan Fitzgerald told me on the phone, his voice steady but tinged with something that made my stomach tighten. "And Kathleen, come alone." The cafe where we met was tucked into a side street in San Francisco, a place James and I had once stopped at after a matinee, back when life was simpler and full of small rituals. Alan was already at a corner table, and I was startled by how much older he looked. More white threaded through his beard, the lines around his eyes carved deeper. But his handshake was still firm, his gaze still clear. After I explained, after I laid bare the whole sordid story, he sat back and said softly, "James would be troubled by what's happening." My throat tightened, but I managed to reply, "James expected better from his son." Alan spread out the papers Joshua had forwarded me, the printer copies Gregory had left lying around like breadcrumbs. He examined them with his reading glasses slipping low on his nose, his expression darkening as he went. "These investment losses are substantial," he said finally, "and this second mortgage, plus the credit card debt. Gregory is underwater, Kathleen, and you're the life raft he's counting on." The words landed like a verdict. "Precisely," Alan added, looking up at me with an edge of urgency in his voice. "I've seen this scenario dozens of times. It rarely ends well for the parent. Once they start circling, they don't stop until there's nothing left." My pulse thudded in my ears. "What would you advise?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a kind of protective intensity. Protect yourself. Immediately. Don't give them another inch. I detailed my holdings. The San Francisco home James and I had built our life in, the Lake Tahoe house that carried his ashes in its soil, the investment accounts, the insurance policies. Alan's pen moved quickly across the page as he asked careful questions, pausing to make sure I understood the gravity of each answer. Who has access to these accounts? He asked finally. No one but me, I told him. He nodded firmly. Keep it that way. Don't sign anything. Don't let them push you with guilt or theatrics. From here on, every decision has to be yours and yours alone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control return. Fragile, but real, like a candle lit in a room I thought had gone completely dark. Alan set his pen down and leaned back, studying me with a kind of quiet respect. And the properties? He asked. Both are in my name alone, I said firmly. James insisted on that. Alan gave a small, approving nod. Smart man. Now, about this wedding. The word alone made my stomach clench. It's in September, I admitted, and they've already claimed my Lake Tahoe house without so much as real consent. He tapped his notes with the end of his pen, thoughtful. It's your property, Kathleen. Legally, you could simply refuse to host the wedding. I pictured the fallout, the finger-pointing, the whispered accusations of cruelty, the health warnings, doctor. Brooks had pressed on me. That would create a storm, I murmured. Alan's gaze sharpened. Yes, but there are other approaches, more definitive ones. That single word, definitive, rang in my chest like a bell. For months I had been parrying their maneuvers, always reacting, never moving first. Perhaps it was time to shift. I'm listening, I told him. Later that afternoon, I walked into my bank, sat across from a young manager with earnest eyes, and laid out the attempted logins to my accounts. She recommended new security protocols, two-step verifications, safeguards that made me feel as if I was finally building a wall where there had only been open doors. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without feeling like I was handing someone else my breath. Back home, my inbox flashed with another demand. A message from Madison, breezy and entitled, requesting final approval for wedding flowers. An $18,000 bill she expected me to sign. On the kitchen counter sat a brochure for yet another retirement community, this one even further from San Francisco. Carolyn's neat script circling a floor plan with the words, "More affordable option?" My phone rang before I could shove it all in a drawer. Joshua's voice trembled with urgency. Grandma, I think you should know. Dad's having dinner with your financial advisor tomorrow. He said something about consolidating your investments for better returns. I thanked him quietly, my hand tightening around the receiver, the ache in my chest shifting into resolve. That night, I called Alan back. I've made my decision, I said. I'd like to explore that definitive option we discussed. He hesitated just long enough to ask, Are you certain? Once we begin this, there's no turning back. I stood at the window, the San Francisco skyline gleaming against the dark bay, and felt James's presence steady in the silence. I'm certain, I told him. It's time I stopped being a passenger in my own life. For the first time in months, I slept deeply, and in my dreams, James was there, nodding with approval as if to say, finally. The next morning, sunlight streamed into my dining room as Jennifer Maxwell spread her real estate portfolio across the table. She had the reputation of being San Francisco's most discreet agent, and Alan had recommended her without hesitation. What exactly are you looking for? She asked. A buyer who can close quickly and values privacy, I replied. When I mentioned the Lake Tahoe property, her eyebrows rose. Waterfront homes in that area usually sit for a while. But she paused, scanning my face as if she could read the urgency behind it. I know a few buyers who've been waiting for exactly this. Private sale could expedite things considerably, Jennifer told me, her voice crisp, efficient. How quickly? I asked, leaning forward. She studied me for a beat before saying, with the right buyer and proper motivation, 45 days, maybe less. I nodded without hesitation. Perfect. That same afternoon, I packed a bag, grabbed the Tahoe keys from the counter, and drove east alone, the winding mountain roads pulling me toward a place that had once been nothing but sanctuary. The house stood waiting at the water's edge, its cedar siding silvered with age, just as James and I had left it. But inside, I found ghosts of plans I had never approved. In the master bedroom, swatches of fabric were pinned against my curtains, samples of paint taped to the wall, and on the desk a floor plan reimagined my own bedroom as the bridal suite. A stack of glossy magazines lay where James's novels used to rest, their covers plastered with smiling couples, frozen in curated perfection. As I walked through the rooms, memory pressed in on me. Gregory learning to swim in the cove below while I clapped from the dock. Joshua building elaborate sandcastles at 6 years old. Madison's 16th birthday bonfire burning bright against the lake's dark water. Each space pulsed with echoes, but now those echoes were being drowned out by someone else's vision. I sat on the porch swing James had built with his own hands, the wood creaking gently beneath me, and watched the waves slap against the rocks. This place had once held our laughter, our arguments, our quiet reconciliations, the marrow of our life. And now it felt like contested territory, a stage being dressed for a play I wanted no part of. My phone buzzed, a message from Gregory. Mom, need to discuss important financial strategy. Dinner tomorrow. Bringing Carolyn and our advisor. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Instead, I called Jennifer. I'd like to proceed with listing the property, I told her, immediately. 2 days later, she called back, brisk but with a note of satisfaction in her voice. I already have interested parties. A tech entrepreneur and his wife. They're prepared to offer full asking price with a 40-day close if we keep this quiet. My answer came fast. Tell them yes. That evening, I moved through the house carefully, pulling the pieces of my life I couldn't leave behind. The photo albums heavy with decades of birthdays and holidays, James's beloved maritime books, the small wooden box with the ashes I had scattered but could never quite let go of. As I was leaving, the front door opened and Madison's wedding planner stumbled in, tablet clutched to her chest, clearly startled to see me. Mrs. O'Connor, I wasn't expecting you. I'm just measuring for the tent placement. No need, I said evenly, sliding the strap of the box higher on my shoulder. The wedding plans have changed. She blinked, confused. Changed? But Madison hasn't mentioned. She doesn't know yet. And I walked past her, the lake air cool against my face, carrying something that felt startlingly like freedom. Driving back toward San Francisco, I realized my chest felt lighter, as if I'd finally remembered how to breathe. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting to their choices, I was making my own. That night, over dinner at my San Francisco home, I shared my decision with Joshua, the words feeling heavier than the plates between us. His fork stopped midair, his eyes searching mine. You're selling the Lake Tahoe house? Before the wedding? I nodded, and he slowly set his utensils down, his expression torn between shock and something that looked like admiration. They're going to lose their minds, he said softly. Probably, I answered, my voice steady, but it's my property to sell. He fell quiet for a long moment, then looked at me with a kind of seriousness that made my throat tighten. You know what's strange, Grandma? I think I respect you more right now than I ever have, and I've always respected you. His words pierced through the armor I had been building, bringing unexpected tears to my eyes, and I managed only, "Thank you, Joshua." As we cleared the table together, he asked the question I had been anticipating. Is this because of what Madison said? About the gift? I paused, rinsing a plate, watching the water spiral down the drain. It's because of what that moment revealed, I said carefully, about how they see me, about what they value. Some realizations can't be unlearned, Joshua. He nodded silently, and I could feel his quiet understanding fill the room more than words ever could. Later, alone in my study, I opened an email from Rachel Bennett, the agent Alan had recommended. The formal purchase offer lay before me, the closing date set for exactly 1 week before Madison's wedding day. With each electronic signature, with every confirming click, I felt decades of weight lifting from my shoulders, the kind of freedom that comes only when you decide to stop asking permission. Whatever storm might be waiting, I knew I was ready to weather it. At 11:23 p.m., my phone buzzed violently against the nightstand, erupting with missed calls and messages. 3 from Gregory, 7 from Madison, the last one in all capital letters. Please tell me this isn't true. I silenced the device, set it face down, and for the first time in months drifted into sleep that was deep, uninterrupted, and strangely peaceful. I dreamed of James that night, his hand on mine, nodding his approval as though he had been waiting for me to finally take this step. Morning came with Gregory pounding on my door, still in his running clothes, sweat glistening on his face and anger radiating off him. The second I opened the door, he barked, "What the hell are you doing?" I looked at him evenly and said, "Good morning to you too, Gregory," before stepping aside. "Coffee?" He shook his head, chest heaving. "I don't want coffee." "I want an explanation. Rachel Bennett? A private sale? What were you thinking?" I poured myself a cup, adding cream with deliberate slowness, the small ritual giving me calm. "I was thinking it's time to simplify my life," I said. His voice rose sharply. "By selling our family's Lake Tahoe house weeks before Madison's wedding? The wedding that's supposed to happen there?" I met his eyes and corrected him gently but firmly. "My house." And yes, he ran a hand through his thinning hair, disbelief written all over his face. "You can't do this." "We've sent invitations, made deposits." But I didn't flinch. For the first time in years, I felt firmly in control of the conversation. "The venue can't be changed now," Gregory snapped, his voice rising with desperation. I kept my tone level, my hands steady around the warm mug. "Then I suggest you start looking for alternatives." His face darkened, eyes narrowing in accusation. "This is about the birthday party, isn't it?" Madison's comment? She was just joking. "Mother, you're overreacting." I studied him over the rim of my cup, taking in the familiar features that mirrored James so clearly and yet carried none of his integrity. "This isn't about one comment, Gregory," I said firmly. "This is about a pattern of behavior, yours included." His brows drew together. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. I set my cup down deliberately, my voice calm but unyielding. "The retirement community brochures left on my table. The financial strategy meetings you arranged without me. The unauthorized attempts to access my accounts." For a moment his expression flickered, the mask slipping. "Those were for your benefit," he countered. "You're getting older." I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "I'm old, Gregory, not incapable. And I'm certainly not senile, though I imagine that narrative might serve your purposes well." That was when his facade cracked, the practiced confidence draining from his face. "Mom, please," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm in trouble." The Westridge development failed. Investors are threatening lawsuits. If I don't find capital... I felt an odd stillness wash over me, a calm sharper than anger. "So this is about money," I said, watching his eyes dart away from mine. "Not about concern for my welfare." He shifted uncomfortably. "It's both," he insisted, but he couldn't meet my gaze. My voice cut through his excuses. "How much do you need?" He hesitated before giving me a number so large it stole the air from the room. Too many zeros confirming everything I already suspected. This wasn't about helping me. It was about saving himself. I rose from my chair, walked to the window, and looked out at the skyline of the city I had called home for nearly 8 decades. The morning sun glinted off the glass towers, indifferent to the storm brewing in my living room. "The sale closes in 5 weeks," I told him evenly. "The proceeds will go into accounts you don't have access to." His voice rose behind me, sharp with betrayal. "You do this to your own family? To Madison? To me?" I didn't turn. "You've left me no choice, Gregory. You've shown me exactly how much respect you have for my autonomy, my wishes, and my place in this family." And for the first time, I felt the power shift back into my hands. "That's not fair," Gregory said, his voice rising, but I turned and faced him squarely. "Isn't it? When was the last time any of you asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I needed?" His silence was long and heavy, and in that quiet I heard more truth than in any excuse he could have offered. That afternoon, Madison showed up unannounced, her eyes red-rimmed, yesterday's makeup smudged into dark shadows beneath them. She didn't bother with greetings. "Nathaniel is freaking out," she blurted, her words sharp and brittle. "His parents are mortified. Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" She stood in my doorway, radiating indignation and panic. Once upon a time, the older version of me would have drawn her into my arms, whispered apologies, tried to repair the cracks in her perfect little image. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood her own value. "About as bad as I looked when you mocked my gift in front of everyone," I said evenly. The words landed like a stone tossed into still water. Madison flinched, her chin trembling, but she straightened quickly, masking it with indignation. "That was different. I was just—" She faltered. I raised an eyebrow. "Being honest?" I let the pause stretch. "So am I. The house is being sold. The wedding needs a new venue." My voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that leaves no room for negotiation. "But why? Why would you do this to me?" she demanded, her voice rising into a whine, her hands balled into fists at her sides. I studied her, really studied her. This granddaughter of mine who was beautiful, privileged, and utterly blind to anyone's existence outside of her own reflection. "I'm not doing anything to you, Madison," I said quietly, though my words carried steel. "I'm simply refusing to let you, or anyone else, do more to me." The silence that followed stretched taut, filled with all the years I had allowed myself to be treated as disposable. Now finally, that silence belonged to me. Whatever storms my family might have been conjuring behind closed doors, I knew my path was firm. 3 weeks before the scheduled closing date, Rachel Bennett called with news that tilted the ground beneath me. "The buyers want to accelerate the timeline," she said. "They're offering an additional $50,000 if we can close in 10 days. For a heartbeat, I hesitated, the echo of Madison's shrill protests and Gregory's angry voice flickering through my mind, but only for a heartbeat. "Tell them yes," I said. That single word set the final course. The house would be gone weeks before the wedding, the crisis they had tried to postpone now rushing toward them like a tide they couldn't stop. That evening I roasted a chicken, the same simple meal James had always called comfort food, and invited Joshua to dinner. He noticed immediately something in my expression had shifted. Over the meal, I told him plainly, "The sale is happening sooner." Next week, his fork paused mid-air before he set it down carefully. "That's decisive," he said, studying me. I gave a small smile. "It feels right." His eyes softened, and I leaned in a little closer. "You're the only one I've told." He blinked, surprised. "Why me?" I held his gaze. "Because you're the only one who sees me as a person, not a resource. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose in a gesture so like his grandfather's that my chest constricted. "They're planning an intervention, you know," he said quietly. "Dad, Mom, Madison. They think you're having some kind of breakdown." The absurdity of it bubbled up in me until I almost laughed, though the sound came out sharp and dry. Of course they do. It's easier to convince themselves I'm unwell than to accept I'm making choices they don't like. Joshua tilted his head, his young face thoughtful, waited with more loyalty than I had expected to find in anyone left in this family. "So, what will you do?" he asked. I reached across the table, covered his hand with mine, and answered with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. "I'll stand my ground." The words hung between us like a vow, and for once I felt certain that I wasn't standing there alone. Later that night, after Joshua left, my phone lit up with a message from Gregory. "Family dinner tomorrow, 7 p.m., my house. Important matters to discuss." The wording was careful, but I could see the net tightening, the trap being laid. I typed a simple reply, "I'll be there," then immediately called Alan Fitzgerald. "They're planning an intervention," I told him, my voice low but steady. "Likely to build a case that I'm not competent to manage my affairs." He didn't hide his concern. "Are you sure you want to attend, Kathleen?" "They may try to twist anything you say." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Absolutely." Running would only strengthen their narrative. The following evening, I dressed with deliberate care, the kind James would have approved of. A tailored navy suit that fit me like armor, pearl earrings that caught the light without being ostentatious, just enough makeup to soften but not hide. The woman who looked back from the mirror wasn't fragile, wasn't doddering. She was resolute, clear-eyed, impossible to mistake for incompetent. Richard's Wellesley home glowed when I pulled up, every light blazing as though the stage had been set for a performance. Through the wide front window I saw them, Richard pacing like a lawyer rehearsing closing arguments, Carolyn fussing with food no one intended to eat, Madison perched with a tissue pressed to her cheek in a display of rehearsed distress. Only Joshua, standing slightly apart, shifted uncomfortably, his body language betraying his unease. I rang the bell, and Richard opened the door, his face arranged into a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mom, thank you for coming." "We've been so worried," he said, ushering me in with the forced warmth of a man who'd practiced his lines. The living room fell quiet as I stepped inside. On the coffee table lay their arsenal, glossy brochures for retirement communities, a handful of business cards from elder law attorneys, and, most telling of all, blank power of attorney documents stacked neatly as if waiting for my signature. The sight would have rattled me once. Now it only confirmed everything I already knew. "Eleanor," Carolyn began, stepping forward with her hands outstretched, her voice dripping with saccharine concern, "we just want what's best for you." These past few weeks have been concerning. "You've been making decisions that seem so unlike you." I let her words hang there, the room pressing in with expectation. Then I smiled faintly, not the polite smile they were accustomed to, but one that carried the weight of knowing. I had walked straight into their trap, yes, but I had come prepared, not to be cornered, but to show them exactly who they were dealing with. Later that night, after Joshua left, my phone lit up with a message from Gregory. "Family dinner tomorrow, 7 p.m., my house. Important matters to discuss." The wording was careful, but I could see the net tightening, the trap being laid. I typed a simple reply, "I'll be there," then immediately called Alan Fitzgerald. "They're planning an intervention," I told him, my voice low but steady, "likely to build a case that I'm not competent to manage my affairs." He didn't hide his concern. "Are you sure you want to attend, Kathleen?" "They may try to twist anything you say." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Absolutely." Running would only strengthen their narrative. The following evening I dressed with deliberate care, the kind James would have approved of. A tailored navy suit that fit me like armor, pearl earrings that caught the light without being ostentatious, just enough makeup to soften but not hide. The woman who looked back from the mirror wasn't fragile, wasn't doddering. She was resolute, clear-eyed, impossible to mistake for incompetent. Richard's Wellesley home glowed when I pulled up, every light blazing as though the stage had been set for a performance. Through the wide front window, I saw them. Richard pacing like a lawyer rehearsing closing arguments, Carolyn fussing with food no one intended to eat, Madison perched with a tissue pressed to her cheek in a display of rehearsed distress. Only Joshua, standing slightly apart, shifted uncomfortably, his body language betraying his unease. I rang the bell and Richard opened the door, his face arranged into a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mom, thank you for coming." "We've been so worried," he said, ushering me in with the forced warmth of a man who'd practiced his lines. The living room fell quiet as I stepped inside. On the coffee table lay their arsenal, glossy brochures for retirement communities, a handful of business cards from elder law attorneys, and, most telling of all, blank power of attorney documents stacked neatly as if waiting for my signature. The sight would have rattled me once. Now it only confirmed everything I already knew. "Eleanor," Carolyn began, stepping forward with her hands outstretched, her voice dripping with saccharine concern. "We just want what's best for you. These past few weeks have been concerning. You've been making decisions that seem so unlike you." I let her words hang there, the room pressing in with expectation. Then I smiled faintly, not the polite smile they were accustomed to, but one that carried the weight of knowing. I had walked straight into their trap. Yes, but I had come prepared, not to be cornered, but to show them exactly who they were dealing with. Gregory's face went pale, the confident mask faltering as my words settled over the room like a fog no one could see through. He fumbled, his lawyer's cadence slipping. "Mom, I was going to explain." The Westridge development was supposed to be a sure thing, the kind of project that changes everything. The investors knew there were risks, but then the market shifted, construction costs ballooned, delays piled up. None of this was my fault. His hands moved in tight gestures, chopping the air as if he could slice reality into more favorable pieces. I listened quietly, sipping my coffee, letting his excuses stack up one after another until they teetered under their own weight. When he paused to catch his breath, I spoke with measured calm. And so the solution was to pry into my accounts, to leave retirement brochures scattered across my table, to paint me as unstable so you could tighten your grip. That's not about saving a business, Gregory. That's about salvaging your pride at my expense. Carolyn shifted in her seat, her hand reaching for his arm as if to steady him, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. "Kathleen, we only wanted to protect you," she said, her tone dripping with practiced sympathy. "When you're under stress, when emotions run high, sometimes decisions get made that aren't in your best interest. Families step in. That's what love looks like." I turned to her slowly, locking eyes. "Love looks like manipulation when it serves your wallet," I said softly, but the steel in my voice made her flinch. Madison gave a dramatic sniffle, pressing a tissue to her face, her voice trembling with accusation. "Grandma, do you even care about me? About what this does to me and Nathaniel? You're humiliating us." For a fleeting moment, I studied her, the same granddaughter who had once sat on my lap while I taught her to thread a needle, now so wrapped in self-pity that she couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't the center. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "This isn't about you, Madison. It's not about the wedding flowers or the venue or how things look on social media. This is about me finally deciding that I am more than a prop in this family's play. I've given and given until there was nothing left of me but what you all demanded. That ends now." My words seemed to hollow out the room. Gregory rubbed at his temples. Carolyn stared at the floor, and Madison's tears felt suddenly out of place, like the wrong lines in the wrong play. Only Joshua met my eyes, and the faint, steady pride in his expression was the only confirmation I needed that I was not losing my mind but reclaiming it. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Gregory finally exhaled, his voice a whisper of desperation. "You'd really do this, Mom? You'd walk away from all of us, leave us to face this mess alone?" I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my suit, and looked at my son, the man who carried James's eyes but none of his honor. "You made your choices," I said, "and now I'm making mine. The sale will close in days, the proceeds will remain under my control, and no signature of mine will ever transfer my autonomy into your hands. If that feels like abandonment to you, then perhaps you should ask yourself why." With that, I picked up my purse, the room still heavy with everything left unsaid, and walked toward the door, my steps steady, my resolve unshaken. "Actually," I said with a small smile at Alan Fitzgerald's surprised expression earlier that day, "I'm not without plans." That evening, Joshua came to my San Francisco home for dinner, the scent of roast vegetables still lingering in the kitchen as we cleared the dishes. Over dessert, I slid an envelope across the table toward him. "What's this?" he asked, curiosity flashing in his eyes as he opened it. Inside was a check with his name written in my hand. His breath caught when he saw the amount. "Grandma, this is too much. I can't." I reached across, closing his fingers gently around it. "You can, and you will. James always said you had an artist's eye, Joshua. He would have wanted to support your passion." For a long moment, he sat there blinking rapidly, his lips parting like he wanted to argue but couldn't quite find the words. Finally, he whispered, "Does Dad know about this?" I shook my head and lifted my teacup, savoring the warmth against my palms. "No, and it's not his business. You're the only one who saw me, Joshua, the only one who bothered to look beneath the surface, to see more than what everyone else dismissed." His eyes glistened, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strand of connection still binding me to my family, fragile but real. Later that night, as I had expected, my phone lit up like a storm. Missed calls stacked one after another. Text messages chimed in relentless succession, the family grapevine having clearly carried the news that the Lake Tahoe sale was complete. At 10:47 p.m. came the inevitable voicemail from Gregory, his tone clipped and professional, the voice of a lawyer dressing his mother down. "Mother, I'm disappointed you've proceeded with this reckless action," he said coldly, as though I were a client who had ignored counsel. His words carried no warmth, no acknowledgement of me as anything but a barrier to his financial rescue. I set the phone face down on the table and exhaled slowly, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. For years I had allowed that voice, calm, authoritative, threaded with entitlement, to dictate the boundaries of my life, but not anymore. That voicemail didn't pierce me the way I once would have let it. It only confirmed that I had chosen correctly, that reclaiming my autonomy was not selfish, but necessary. Outside, the city lights shimmered over the bay, and for the first time in decades, I felt like they were shining for me. Vanessa's message landed first, dripping with self-righteous martyrdom. "We need to discuss damage control immediately. Eleanor, I hope you realize what you've done to this family." Then came Madison's barrage. 16 messages, each more frantic than the last, the final one screaming in all caps, "My life is ruined and it's your fault." I read none of them past the first lines. Instead, I silenced my phone, placed it on the nightstand, and drifted into sleep more peaceful than any I had known in months. Their storms no longer touched me the same way. Their noise was just static against the quiet certainty I carried. The next morning, I met with a new real estate agent. This time not Rachel Bennett, but a woman specializing in properties for active seniors. Together, we toured 3 condominiums in modern buildings, each with security, amenities, and a closeness to the cultural life I had denied myself for years. Standing in a corner unit on the 15th floor in Cambridge, overlooking the Charles River, she said softly, "This one has the best views, and private elevator access ensures exceptional security." I turned slowly, taking in the light-filled space, so different from the dark wood and heavy drapery of my current home. It wasn't just a condo, it felt like a rebirth. "It's perfect," I told her. By afternoon, I had made an offer, and by evening, it was accepted. Gregory arrived unannounced not long after, pounding on my door just past 8, his expression thunderous. "You're buying property without consulting me? After everything that's happened?" His voice filled the entryway with accusation. I let him in, though my calm felt like porcelain, fragile but polished. "I wasn't aware I needed your consultation to choose my own home." He opened his mouth, stopped, then tried again. "Mother, I'm trying to help you." I shook my head slowly. "No, Gregory. You're trying to control me. There's a difference." He began pacing, agitation in every line of his body, spitting out words about family crisis, Madison's wedding in ruins, Logan's parents threatening to walk away. "Those sound like problems for Madison and Logan to solve," I said quietly, and his head snapped toward me in disbelief. "How can you be so cold?" "This is your granddaughter's future." I studied the man I had raised, the son whose moral compass had spun so far from true north. "Richard," I said, my voice steady, "when exactly did my existence become solely about supporting everyone else's dreams without any regard for my own?" His silence was answer enough. I continued, "You planned to move me into a retirement home without my consent. You attempted to access my accounts. You staged an intervention based on lies about my mental competence, all because I made choices you didn't like." He had no answer. "The new property closes in 3 weeks, I told him. "I'll be downsizing considerably. You and Carolyn are welcome to select any furniture or items before I arrange for estate sales." His eyes searched mine desperately. "You're really going through with this?" I held his gaze and answered simply, "Yes, Gregory, I really am." After he left, I stood at the window, the city lights glittering like watchful stars, my chest heavy with grief, yet buoyed by determination. I was losing my family, or perhaps more accurately, finally discovering that they had never truly been mine to begin with. The realization carried a heaviness, but also a strange clarity, as if a fog I had lived in for decades had finally lifted. My phone chimed with a text from Joshua. "Just heard about Cambridge. Proud of you, Grandma. Need help packing?" The words made me pause, my throat tightening. At least one bridge remained intact among the burning ruins of my family ties, and though it felt fragile, it would have to be enough. Later that week, he and I sat together in a small cafe near Boston Common. The September air was unusually warm, the windows propped open so the smells of roasted chestnuts and faint exhaust drifted in. Joshua stirred his coffee slowly, then looked up at me with hesitant eyes. "Logan called off the engagement," he said. For a moment I could only blink, my mind struggling to catch up. "I'm sorry to hear that," I answered softly, and I meant it. Whatever my anger at Madison, I had never wished her the hollow ache of abandonment. "His parents got spooked," Joshua went on. "They said the family instability was too much." He spoke the phrase with bitter irony, as though it were an official diagnosis stamped on our name. Outside the window, a young couple strolled past, pushing a stroller, the baby's laughter rising above the city hum, and I thought fleetingly of Madison at that age, tugging at James's hand, her curls bouncing in the sunlight. For a moment I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unexpected. But guilt was quickly followed by resolve. This unraveling hadn't begun with me, even if I was the one refusing to stitch it back together. Joshua kept stirring his coffee, though it had long gone cold. "Amber's devastated," he said finally, using her name instead of the shorthand I had grown used to. She hasn't left her apartment in 3 days. Dad's blaming you entirely. I let out a small sigh, more weary than angry. Of course. Of course he is. The clink of cutlery, the murmur of other diners, the hiss of milk steaming at the counter, all of it blurred while I sat with the weight of his words. It's easier than examining his own role in all this, I said. Joshua hesitated, eyes flicking between me and the street outside. Would you consider talking to her? Not to apologize, but just... He trailed off, chewing at his lip. I think she's really struggling. I considered his request, feeling the conflict rise in me. A part of me wanted to slam that door shut. Madison had chosen her cruelty and choices had consequences. Yet another part, softer and older, remembered her as a child sitting at my kitchen table with cookie dough smudged across her face, begging me to let her lick the spoon. That memory pulled at me, a reminder of the girl she had once been before entitlement hardened her. My palms pressed against the warm ceramic of my cup, grounding me, and I realized I was torn, not between anger and forgiveness, but between survival and vulnerability. Was reaching out to her a step backward into old patterns of accommodation? Or could it be a way to reclaim my voice by offering words on my terms, not theirs? The air from the open window carried the scent of damp earth from the common, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle. I'll think about it, I told Joshua finally, my voice quieter than I intended. And for the first time in a long while, I realized that my choices, every single one of them, belonged to me. I'll think about it, I'd told Joshua, but I hadn't expected the decision to weigh on me quite so quickly. Later that afternoon, my phone rang, and Judith's voice filled the line with her familiar bluntness. I ran into Madison at Bloomingdale's, she said without preamble. She was returning wedding gifts. Eleanor, she looks terrible. Her words made me straighten in my chair. Thomas mentioned she's taking the breakup hard, I replied cautiously. It's more than that, Judith said firmly. She looked broken, not just sad. When she saw me, she burst into tears right there in Housewares. I pictured my granddaughter surrounded by gleaming crystal stemware and pristine china, crying in the middle of a store that had once symbolized everything she thought she deserved. The image pierced something in me I had assumed was long calcified. When I hung up, the house was too quiet, the walls filled with the sounds of memory rather than the present. I went to my study and opened an old cedar box of photographs. One by one, I spread them across the desk. Madison as a toddler at the beach, her small hand clutching mine, sand stuck between her toes. Madison at 10, proudly holding up a blue science fair ribbon, her grin so wide it seemed to light up the frame. Madison at 16, rolling her eyes at some offhand comment of mine, but smiling despite herself, the sweetness of the girl still flickering beneath the new armor of adolescence. My chest tightened as I traced the curve of her younger face with my fingertip, the paper worn smooth from years of handling. When had it shifted? When had that affectionate child hardened into the young woman who could humiliate me in front of an entire room, her laughter sharp as glass? Was it my silence in the face of smaller slights? The way I smoothed things over instead of setting boundaries that allowed her cruelty to bloom unchecked? Or had I, in my anger, become no better, wielding my financial power like a weapon designed to wound her where it hurt most? The thought unsettled me. The idea that perhaps we had both been acting from places of pain rather than love, each of us lashing out in our own way. I looked around at the half-packed boxes stacked against the walls, the spines of James's books lined up in careful rows, ready to be moved, the scent of cardboard and dust hanging in the air. Every object I lifted reminded me of the life I had lived, the roles I had played, Mother, wife, grandmother, provider, peacemaker, and now perhaps the reluctant avenger. My hands lingered on a book of James's poetry. The leather cracked at the edges, and I asked myself the question I had avoided for weeks. Was I protecting myself, or was I punishing her? The answer was not simple, and as I closed the box, I felt both the weight of my resolve and the ache of my uncertainty pressing against my ribs, reminding me that even victory can carry its own quiet sorrow. The Cambridge condominium would be ready in 2 weeks, and the thought of fresh walls and sunlight-filled rooms brought me comfort. My Boston home had already drawn quiet inquiries, though I hadn't officially listed it. I was starting to feel the gravity of closing one life and opening another when the phone rang. Richard's voice came strained, his words careful in a way I recognized from his courtroom tactics. "Mom, I know things have been difficult, but I'm asking you, professionally and personally, to call Madison. She's in a dangerous place, emotionally." My stomach clenched. "Is she getting help?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. His hesitation was a confession. "She doesn't want to see a therapist. Says it would be admitting defeat. So like our family, isn't it? Appearance over actual healing." I pressed my lips together, thinking of all the generations of silence we had wrapped around our wounds, and then I said, "I'll reach out." That evening, after pacing the living room for nearly an hour, I finally texted her, "Would you like to meet for coffee tomorrow?" Her reply came instantly. "Why? So you can gloat?" My fingers hovered before I typed back, "No, so I can listen." A long pause followed, the 3 dots of her typing flashing and disappearing, and then, "Fine. Cafe Nero on Newbury, 2 p.m. The message left me with a mixture of dread and resolve. I went to bed early. Though sleep did not come easily, my mind circling through memories of her as a child, her laughter on the beach, her teenage scowls that always ended in reluctant smiles. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early, choosing a quiet corner table where the afternoon light slanted across the polished wood. The smell of roasted beans and faint vanilla hung in the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and clinking cups. I sat with my hands folded, rehearsing words that never seemed to settle into sentences, my heart beating faster than I cared to admit. At exactly 2 o'clock, Madison appeared, her posture stiff, dark sunglasses covering half her face, though the sky outside was clouded and gray. She moved toward me slowly, as if weighed down by invisible chains. When she removed the glasses, her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, her complexion sallow, her skin bearing the map of nights without rest. "You look awful," I blurted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. To my surprise, she let out a jagged laugh, more broken than amused. "Thanks, Grandma." Always the straight shooter. Shame flushed through me. "I'm sorry." That was unkind. I hesitated, then added softly, "But accurate." She stirred her coffee without lifting it, the spoon clinking against porcelain in an endless rhythm. "Logan's already dating someone else," she said suddenly, her voice flat. "Instagram official yesterday, 3 weeks after canceling our wedding." My chest tightened with the rawness of her confession, and though I had rehearsed a dozen possible reactions, all I could manage was the truth. "I truly am sorry about that," I whispered, and for the first time in a long while she looked at me without defiance, only hollow sadness. ChatGPT Skazal, "Are you?" Madison's eyes met mine, sharp and challenging, as if daring me to contradict her grief. "You sold the house where we were supposed to get married. You knew what would happen." Her words were an accusation, but beneath them I caught the tremor of a child still wanting her grandmother's approval. I took a slow breath. "I knew there would be consequences," I admitted, my voice steady. "I didn't specifically predict this one." She leaned forward, her voice rising. "Why did you do it?" Was humiliating me really worth destroying your relationship with the entire family? The question landed heavy in the small cafe, the clatter of dishes and the low hum of strangers around us, fading as if the world were waiting for my answer. Instead of deflecting, I asked my own question. How did you feel when you opened my gift at your party? Her face flickered with annoyance. I don't know what that has to... Please answer the question, Madison. I pressed gently but firmly. Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her, replaced by something raw. Fine, she said finally, staring into her untouched coffee. I thought it looked homemade and cheap. I was embarrassed because everyone else had given me expensive things. She said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage, but I saw the shame creeping in even as the words left her lips. And did you consider how I might feel when you said that? In front of everyone? My question was soft but sharp enough to cut through her defenses. A flush spread across her pale cheeks, and for the first time in months, I saw her without the armor of entitlement. She swallowed hard. Not really. Not until later. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she stared down at the table as though the grain of the wood could offer her an escape. I sat back, letting the silence stretch. It wasn't the silence of punishment, but of truth, settling in, uncomfortable and undeniable. Watching her struggle, I felt a complicated ache. Love for the girl she had been, pity for the woman she had become, and a wary caution about the damage she was still capable of inflicting. Around us, life in the cafe went on, cups clinking, conversations rising and falling. But in that corner, at that table, it was only us, two women tethered by blood and bound by years of misunderstanding, finally forced to confront the cost of what had been said and done. That's my answer then, I said, my voice steady though my heart thudded hard in my chest. I was tired of not being considered, of having my feelings, my preferences, my very autonomy treated as irrelevant to everyone else's plans. Madison's eyes brimmed with tears, her lower lip trembling as she bit it to keep control. So you deliberately ruined my wedding to teach me a lesson? She asked, her tone sharp but breaking underneath. I shook my head slowly. No, I sold my property because I finally recognized it had become more important to all of you than I was. The truth of it landed between us, raw and undeniable. I leaned forward slightly, my hand hovering just above hers on the table, close enough for her to feel the intention but not the touch. The house was a symbol, Madison. The real issue was that none of you saw me as a person anymore. To you, I was an asset to be managed, an obstacle to be navigated, or a resource to be exploited. Not a woman who had lived, loved, and lost, but just someone to bankroll your dreams. She didn't speak, but her silence was different this time, less defensive, more porous, as if my words were seeping into places she had carefully walled off. For the first time in years, I felt she was truly listening. Did you know there was a diamond inside one of those knitted dolls? I asked softly. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. What? The single word was almost a gasp. My grandmother's diamond from her engagement ring, I said gently. James had it reset for me on our 50th anniversary. I'd tucked it inside the doll, hidden but safe. I intended it for you. She stared at me, her face stricken, and then whispered, I threw them away. The dolls. I threw them in the trash that night. Her words cut like glass, and in that instant we both knew what had been lost. Forever. The finality pressed down like the weight of earth on a grave. I drew in a slow breath and let it out, my voice quiet. I think we've all thrown away things more valuable than we realized. Her tears slipped free then, trailing down her cheeks unchecked, and for a long moment we sat in the heavy air of hurt and missed connections. We parted without resolution, our goodbye clumsy, her shoulders hunched as she left the cafe, my chest tight as I watched her disappear into the crowd. Yet beneath the grief, there was something else. A small shift, a crack in the wall of resentment we had both built too high. And in that fragile opening, I allowed myself to hope that one day, light might filter through. My new Cambridge condominium felt like a cleansing breath after years of holding myself too tightly. The floor-to-ceiling windows poured sunlight across sleek hardwood floors, chasing away the gloom that had clung to my old brownstone with its sagging stairs and sighing pipes. Here, everything was fresh and open, each room humming with quiet possibility. Even the building itself seemed to cradle me with care, its discreet security staff and key-carded elevators offering a kind of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing until I felt it settle into my bones. For the first time in decades, I lived in a space chosen not for tradition, not for anyone else's approval, but for me. 2 weeks after I'd unpacked my last box, Joshua arrived for dinner, carrying a bottle of wine in one hand and a neatly wrapped package in the other. "Housewarming gift," he said with a shy smile as he handed them over. "Nothing expensive or fancy, just something I thought you'd appreciate." I peeled back the paper carefully and found myself staring at a framed photograph. His work, the image alive with color and memory. The beach house stood at the edge of the frame, its windows glowing amber against a fiery sunset, waves crashing with the kind of restless power I had always loved. My breath caught. "It's beautiful," I said, tracing the outline of the house with my fingertip. "When did you take this?" He shrugged lightly. "Last summer. I always thought it captured something essential about the place." We sat down to eat, the wine breathing in our glasses, and as we talked, he glanced around the apartment, his eyes taking in the clean lines, the brightness, the quiet hum of city life below. "You seem lighter here, Grandma," he said after a pause, his tone gentle but sure, "less burdened." I smiled, touched by his observation, because it was true in ways I hadn't yet put into words. "I feel lighter," I admitted. There was no longer the sense of being trapped in a museum of my past, every object tethered to expectation or memory. Instead, I felt rooted in the present, free to claim a new rhythm that belonged entirely to me. After he left, I stood alone in the quiet of my home, holding the photograph. I hung it in a place where the morning sun would strike it first, bathing the image in golden light. The beach house was gone, its walls no longer mine to guard or grieve, but the memory lived on, preserved not in the bitterness of loss, but in the artistry of my grandson's eye. It was a reminder that endings could hold beauty too, that letting go did not erase what had been. And as I stood there, watching the photograph glow with the rising light, I realized this new chapter might not be about what I had left behind, but about what I still carried forward. "And how does that feel?" Dr. Brooks had asked, and I remembered answering that it felt like removing a splinter that had been festering for years. Painful, yes, but necessary if real healing was ever going to begin. I carried that thought with me later in the week when I opened my door to find Vanessa standing there, unannounced. She was dressed in the same immaculate style I had always associated with her. Silk blouse tucked into tailored trousers, diamonds catching the afternoon light, but something in her posture betrayed her. Less polished certainty, more hesitation. She stepped inside after a clipped greeting, her eyes sweeping my new Cambridge condo with a faint trace of surprise. "Your new place is lovely," she said finally. "Very you." I inclined my head politely. "Thank you. Would you like some tea?" We sat across from each other, the steam rising from our mugs filling the silence between us. It was uncomfortable, that silence, the kind that magnifies every small sound, the clink of ceramic against wood, the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. At last, she spoke, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Eleanor, I owe you an apology. I blinked, startled. Of all the things I had expected from this visit, contrition was not one of them. She didn't give me time to respond. Richard and I are separating, she said, her words tumbling out quickly. The financial strain, the constant stress, the fights. It's been building for years. For the first time, I noticed the faint lines of exhaustion around her mouth, the way her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. I'm sorry to hear that, I said carefully, meaning it more than I thought I would. Vanessa gave a small, humorless smile. Are you? She asked, her eyes narrowing with painful honesty. We haven't exactly been kind to you. I looked at her evenly, choosing my words with care. Family relationships are complex. It was as neutral as I could make it, though the truth was far less forgiving. She dropped her gaze to her perfectly manicured nails, her facade cracking further. When you sold the Lake Tahoe house, it forced a lot of things into the open. Richard's financial mess, our marriage, how fragile it really was. Madison and Logan's relationship, which was apparently shakier than any of us wanted to admit. She raised her head then, meeting my eyes directly, for perhaps the first time in years. Sometimes a single action can reveal truth on multiple levels, she said. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her admission settle between us. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. An acknowledgement that what had begun as an act of self-preservation had rippled outward in ways none of us could have foreseen. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and in that quiet I sensed a fragile bridge forming, not sturdy enough to cross yet, but strong enough to see from both sides. Vanessa's words lingered long after the door closed behind her, her admission reshaping memories I thought were set in stone. The retirement community brochures, the power of attorney, that was me. I had sat at that staged intervention convinced Gregory had been the sole architect, yet here she was, owning the role she had played. It startled me, not because I hadn't suspected her influence, but because she offered it freely, without coercion, without the usual layer of justification. When I asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" her answer was stripped of artifice. She spoke of aging, of her own mother, of the uncomfortable truth that she had mirrored the very behavior she once resented. Watching her blink back tears she didn't want to shed, I realized I was witnessing not performance, but genuine reckoning. Her parting words followed me into the evening. For what it's worth, Eleanor, I think you did the right thing. It just took me a while to see it. I repeated them aloud in the empty kitchen, as if hearing them twice might help me believe them. Later, I called Judith and relayed the entire encounter, my voice low, carrying equal parts disbelief and cautious hope. She listened without interruption, then said in her familiar grounding tone, "People can surprise you, sometimes even pleasantly. It feels like the beginning of something rather than the end." Her words softened something inside me, loosening the knot of cynicism that had been tightening for months. "Maybe it is," I said, staring out at the Charles River glittering in the night. "Not a restoration. That was impossible. What had been fractured couldn't be glued back into its original shape. But perhaps Judith was right. Something new could form, different but honest, fragile but real. A foundation not of obligation and appearances, but of truth and choice. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my act of defiance hadn't only destroyed, it might have cleared ground for rebuilding. Later, alone with my thoughts, I found myself drifting to the memory of the knitted dolls, the diamond hidden and then lost, the gesture misunderstood and discarded. Perhaps the metaphor was too obvious, yet it clung to me nonetheless. The dolls were gone, the diamond gone, the house sold to strangers. The family I had once known was fractured beyond recognition. Yet from those ashes, new relationships were beginning to take shape, Not replicas of the past, but something altered, tested, and potentially stronger for having been broken. And I realized with a clarity that surprised me, respect built on truth, even if fragile, was worth more than loyalty built on manipulation. Authenticity rather than appearance. It wasn't the path I had expected, but then again, the most meaningful transformations rarely announce themselves in tidy ways. On a crisp October morning, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, I opened my inbox to find an email from Gregory. It was the first direct communication since our explosive confrontation weeks earlier, and the subject line was just one word: coffee? I hesitated, then typed back, yes. We agreed on a small cafe halfway between our homes, a neutral ground where neither of us could claim an advantage. He arrived right on time, a habit drilled into him from years in court. But what startled me most wasn't his punctuality. It was his attire. Gone was the tailored armor of his three-piece suits, replaced by dark jeans and a soft gray sweater. For the first time in years, he looked less like a polished attorney and more like a man stripped bare by circumstance. After ordering coffee for both of us, he sat across from me and said quietly, "You look well, Mom." "The new place must agree with you." I inclined my head. "It does," I said simply, though inside I was scanning his face, noting the deepening grooves at the corners of his eyes, the fatigue etched into his jawline. "Vanessa mentioned you're separating," I said after a moment, testing the ground. He nodded, his shoulders sagging just slightly. "It's been coming for a long time." The financial crisis only sped it along. There was no anger in his voice, only resignation. For once he wasn't posturing. I held his gaze. "I'm sorry." His eyes flicked up, surprised. "Are you?" The question wasn't hostile, more weary than anything else. "For your pain, yes," I said, carefully. "For the end of a relationship that wasn't working?" "No." Something softened then, the faintest smile tugging at his lips, not triumphant or bitter, but almost human. "Fair enough," he murmured, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup as though it might anchor him. And for a brief, fragile moment, I saw not the ambitious, domineering man who had tried to control me, but the little boy who once clung to James's hand on his first day of school, eyes wide with fear, trusting us to guide him safely inside. That memory threaded through the present, and I realized that while forgiveness was far away, recognition was possible. It was a beginning, not of reconciliation, but of honesty. "Always direct," Gregory said, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Dad would be proud of how you've handled all this." The mention of James caught me off guard, the sudden rush of memory warming and aching in equal measure. "I'd like to think so," I murmured, steadying myself as the server set down our coffees, giving us both a momentary reprieve from the heaviness of our conversation. Gregory reached for the cream, stirring it into his cup with deliberate care, as if buying time before his next admission. "I've had to declare personal bankruptcy," he said at last, the words landing with the dull weight of inevitability. "The Westridge failure was worse than I let on. More investors, bigger losses." I nodded, not surprised, the pieces having already been visible if anyone had cared enough to notice. "I suspected as much." He gave a small, rueful laugh. "Yes, you always were observant." Then he looked me straight in the eye, no deflection, no practiced rhetoric. I should have just asked for help instead of everything else. The rawness in his voice almost stirred pity, but I stayed firm. "Yes," I said evenly, "you should have." His eyes searched mine, vulnerable now. "Would you have helped if I'd been honest from the beginning?" I let the question hang, letting the truth surface slowly. "I would have listened," I said finally. "I might have helped, with conditions. But we'll never know now, will we? The space between us filled with what could not be undone. the weight of missed chances pressing in until even the noise of the cafe seemed hushed. Gregory broke the silence first, his voice quieter, less combative. "I've taken a position with a small nonprofit legal center. The pay is a fraction of what I'm used to, but surprisingly, it feels good, fulfilling." I studied him, surprised at the sincerity, the way his words carried something other than ambition. "That's a significant change," I said. He nodded. "A necessary change." He took a slow sip of his coffee as though grounding himself in its warmth. "I'm staying with Joshua for now," he added, almost sheepishly. "He's been remarkably supportive." The corner of my mouth lifted. "He's a good man," I said, "better than either of us deserve." Gregory chuckled, the sound soft and self-deprecating, and for the first time in years it didn't carry the sting of superiority. "Apparently," he said, "he's been building a photography business on the side for years." "He's quite talented," pride swelled in my chest. Quiet but undeniable. "He is," I agreed, my voice gentle. In that moment I felt the faint stirrings of something between us. Not reconciliation, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile thread of honesty, spun thin and tentative, but strong enough to notice. I left it at that, resisting the impulse to mention the quiet financial support I'd already funneled toward Joshua. Richard needed to see me as more than a safety net, and I needed to remember that I wasn't one anymore. "Look, Mom," he said, setting his cup down carefully, his tone almost formal. "I'm not here to ask for money or forgiveness or anything, really. I just wanted to acknowledge that I handled everything badly. Catastrophically badly." His words came haltingly, but they came, and for the first time in years I sensed they weren't rehearsed. "Thank you for saying that," I answered, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were. Too much has happened." He shifted, his hands clasped together, the boyish nervousness flickering across a face lined by consequence. "But I'd like to start something new, if you're willing." I studied him for a long moment, taking in the weight of who he was now, not the ambitious attorney, not the manipulative son who had tried to maneuver me out of my own life, but a flawed, struggling man who, despite everything, was still my child. "I'm willing to try," I said finally, with boundaries, of course. Relief softened his features, his shoulders lowering as though he had been carrying a weight too long. "That's more than fair." We stood, gathering coats, the air between us tentative but less fractured than it had been in years. As we reached the door, Richard hesitated, then asked, "Have you spoken with Madison recently?" I shook my head. "Not since our coffee meetup last month." He nodded, his expression shading into something I couldn't quite read. "She's been through a lot. The canceled wedding, Logan's very public new relationship, losing her job. It's been a perfect storm." For the first time in his voice, I heard not anger or blame, but genuine concern. "Is she getting help?" I asked, repeating the question I had grown used to asking about her. For a moment he looked away, then back at me, and finally he nodded. "Yes." Thomas convinced her to see someone. Relief washed over me in a slow wave, tempered by caution but real nonetheless. Outside, the October air was brisk, the trees lining the street shedding their leaves in quiet cascades. We walked out together, side by side but at a respectful distance, and for the first time in decades, I realized that while Richard would never again be my anchor, he also no longer had the power to drag me under. I could choose how close or far I kept him, and that, finally, felt like freedom. It seems the therapy was beginning to help because when Amber arrived the next afternoon, there was a steadiness about her I hadn't seen in years. She carried a small paper bag, the kind boutiques hand out, folded neatly at the top, as though she'd been afraid of losing whatever was inside. "Found something I think belongs to you," she said by way of greeting. Her voice was softer than before, absent of the defensive edge that had once been her armor. I invited her in, noticing that her complexion carried a faint flush, her hair brushed, her clothes simple but clean. Small signs, but hopeful ones. She set the bag on my dining table and stepped back. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were 2 knitted dolls, slightly rumpled, one with a stray thread dangling from its arm, but unmistakably mine. My breath caught. "Where did you—" I began. Amber shifted uncomfortably. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said at the cafe about the diamond. I thought I'd thrown them away, but I remembered I shoved them into a donation box. Yesterday, I went to the thrift store and asked. They still had them, tucked on a shelf. Her eyes brimmed with tears. I don't know if the diamond's still there, but I couldn't just leave them." My fingers trembled as I reached into the bag, cradling the little figures. For weeks, I'd resigned myself to the idea that the heirloom was gone forever, buried under layers of trash and indifference. Slowly, carefully, I pressed the seams of the bride doll, and there, faint but unmistakable, I felt the hard outline of the gem hidden within. A rush of relief and grief swept through me all at once. "It's still here," I whispered. Amber let out a shaky laugh that cracked into a sob, covering her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I was awful to you. I didn't see you, didn't respect you, and I can't undo that." I set the dolls gently on the table and reached for her hands, pulling them down so she would meet my eyes. "You can't undo it," I said softly, "but you can learn from it. We both can." For a long moment, we sat like that, across the table, the air thick with words unspoken but understood. The past couldn't be erased, but perhaps it didn't have to define every chapter forward. When she left an hour later, the dolls carefully rewrapped and placed on my mantel, I stood by the window, watching the Charles River gleam in the late autumn light. The house was gone, the family fractured, but in my condominium filled with sun, a new kind of legacy had begun, one not rooted in property or possessions, but in truth reclaimed, respect earned, and the fragile beginnings of healing. Gifts aren't about deserving. She placed the diamond and dolls on the coffee table between us. I can't take it. Not after everything. But I needed you to know I found it, that I finally understood what you were trying to give me. As she prepared to leave, Madison hesitated by the door. "I'm in therapy now. It's helping me see things differently. About myself, about you, about everything really. I'm glad. I'm not ready to talk about it all yet," she continued. "But maybe someday. I'll be here, I promised." After she left, I held the knitted dolls, faded now, slightly squashed from their time in storage, but intact. The diamond lay beside them, catching the light in prismatic bursts. Some gifts, once rejected, can never be offered again in the same way, but perhaps new gifts, different ones, could take their place. I carefully returned the diamond to its hiding place inside the doll. Some treasures needed to remain hidden until the right moment or the right recipient came along. 1 year to the day after Madison's fateful birthday party, I hosted a small gathering in my San Francisco condominium overlooking the bay. The guest list was selective: Joshua and his new partner Emily, Gregory, alone but seeming content with that status, Norma, Alan, and most surprisingly, Madison, who arrived last bearing a bouquet of fall flowers. "Happy housewarming," she said, kissing my cheek. "Belated, I know." My home, fully settled now, reflected my new life. Gone were the heavy antiques and somber paintings from the old brownstone. In their place, comfortable modern furniture, vibrant artwork, some of it Joshua's photography, and large windows that welcomed light, rather than shutting it out. Over dinner, conversation flowed more easily than I could have imagined possible a year ago. Gregory spoke about his nonprofit work with genuine passion. Joshua shared news of an upcoming gallery showing. Madison, quieter than her former self but more authentically present, mentioned her return to graduate school. "Art history," she explained, "what I was studying before I got distracted by everything else." After dessert, Joshua raised his glass to Grandma Kathleen, who taught us all that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. And that true value isn't always visible on the surface, added Madison, meeting my eyes with a small smile. Later, as the gathering wound down, Madison pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the living room. She opened her purse slowly, as though unsure if she should follow through, and then set a small box on the table between us. Inside was a pendant, the diamond I had hidden months ago, now placed in a simple silver frame that seemed both modest and timeless. Her words tumbled out quickly, as if she had rehearsed them on the way over. She reminded me I had once said she could keep it, but explained that she wanted me to wear it now rather than leave it tucked away for some distant future. I lifted the pendant carefully, turning it in the light, and its brilliance filled the room with a quiet radiance that carried more weight than any extravagant setting could have offered. Madison's voice softened as she confessed that she had been replaying the memory of that birthday, and through therapy had begun to understand her own reaction. She admitted that much of her life had been consumed by chasing approval through material things, appearances, and social standing, never truly learning to see genuine worth when it stood before her. Her words didn't come with drama or excuses, but with a raw honesty that made me realize this conversation marked a shift I had long prayed for. I listened, holding the pendant, remembering the years of disappointment, and hoping this moment might become the first stone laid in a very different foundation between us. I told her calmly that we only pass down what we know, and that her parents had raised her to put appearances above authenticity, though that explanation didn't absolve her of responsibility now that she was an adult. She nodded, admitting that truth, and then added that the sale of the Lake Tahoe house had devastated her at first, but it also forced her to stop pretending and to confront the difference between what she truly wanted and what she thought was expected of her. Her hand brushed the pendant as if to anchor herself, and for the first time in years, I saw not the dismissive girl from that party, but a young woman trying to redefine her place in the world without the shallow markers that had guided her for too long. When I asked what it was she wanted now, her expression softened into a genuine smile, one that carried none of the pretense I had grown accustomed to. She said she longed to create something meaningful, to pursue knowledge in a field that mattered to her, and to build relationships rooted in respect rather than utility. I told her those were worthy aspirations, but she surprised me by saying they had always been mine, and that she had simply been too blind to notice until now. Later, after the guests had gone and the evening had grown quiet, Gregory remained behind in the kitchen, quietly helping to clear dishes despite my protests, and the sight of him moving with uncharacteristic humility struck me as one more sign that perhaps change, however fragile, had begun to take root. Gregory brushed off my protests and said quietly that I should let him do this one small thing, calling it symbolic restitution, as if drying dishes could balance years of distance. In the quiet of the kitchen, away from the murmur of the others, he surprised me with a confession I hadn't expected. He'd gone to meet the new owners of the Lake Tahoe house just a few weeks earlier. The admission startled me, and I asked why he would put himself through that. He shrugged, saying it might have been a search for closure or perhaps an act of masochism, before explaining how the house looked nothing like it once had. The walls were painted in new colors, the furniture replaced, even the yard had been reshaped with landscaping foreign to us. I asked if that sight had unsettled him, but he shook his head and admitted it had not. In fact, he said the changes had clarified something that had haunted him. The realization that what he longed for wasn't the house itself, but the meaning it carried. It had stood as a symbol of family, of stability, of belonging, things he admitted he had put at risk in his relentless pursuit of financial success and status. Hearing him speak this way was almost disorienting. The tone was stripped of arrogance, weighted instead with regret. For a moment, I glimpsed the boy I once raised, rather than the man who had spent years trying to control me. He rinsed another plate and handed it to me to dry, a gesture so ordinary it felt almost sacred. In a low voice, he admitted that he had nearly destroyed the very bonds he now realized were worth more than any development deal. I responded that we all make mistakes, though some of them are heavier, carving wounds that take longer to heal. He gave a small, rueful smile and nodded, saying only that he was learning, though slowly. The words hung between us with a kind of fragile honesty that felt new, as if we were both stepping carefully across a bridge neither of us trusted yet. When the night finally drew to a close and the door shut behind the last of my guests, I walked onto my balcony alone, letting the cool air wrap around me. The pendant Madison had returned rested against my skin, the diamond cool and steady as though reminding me of resilience hidden in plain sight. Below me, the Charles shimmered with the reflection of city lights, each ripple of water catching fragments of illumination and scattering them into the dark, and I stood there quietly, letting the scene remind me that even fractured things can still reflect beauty when the light finds them. The Lake Tahoe house was gone, and with it the illusion that my family was unshakable. What I had believed would last forever had been dismantled, examined, and then pieced together in a different way, less polished, less certain, but somehow more honest. The people I once trusted without question had revealed their faults, and I had revealed my own strength. Nothing was the same, but for the first time in years, I felt that everything was truer. One evening, I caught sight of myself reflected in the glass door leading to my balcony, my back straight, my eyes clear, my expression firm yet calm. I barely recognized the woman looking back, no longer the grandmother who tucked diamonds inside handmade dolls to win affection, nor the wounded matriarch who sold a home in desperation to prove a point, but someone transformed by fire. At 79, I had finally understood that boundaries weren't acts of cruelty, but necessities for survival. I had learned that respect couldn't be purchased with property, nor could love be sustained by obligation. What endured, what truly mattered, was family stripped of pretense, those few who could stand before me without performance, without entitlement, and still be worthy of my trust. I touched the pendant at my throat, the diamond cool against my skin, a stone that had traveled as difficult a road as I had. Like me, it had once been discarded as insignificant, and like me, its value had eventually been recognized, not because of how it looked at first glance, but because of the history and strength it carried within. When I told Norma about Madison's decision to reset the diamond and return it to me, she simply said, "Perfect timing. You were meant to wear it now, not keep it hidden for someone else's future." She was right, of course. The season of hiding, my opinions, my needs, my true self, was over. From my balcony, I looked out over the San Francisco skyline, its lights scattered across the dark water. Somewhere in that city, my old brownstone now echoed with the voices of another family creating their own memories. Far away in Lake Tahoe, strangers were making new traditions within walls that had once sheltered mine. And yet in the quiet glow of my new home, I felt no loss, only release. This was the chapter I never expected to write, one where I no longer stood in the background of someone else's story, but claimed the central role in my own. The diamond at my throat shimmered as I turned back toward the warmth of my condominium, a reminder that not every treasure had been lost. Some had been recovered, and others, more precious still, had only just been discovered. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was better, harder, sharper, clearer, and far more honest. Above all, it was mine. If this story touched something in you, don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. And give this video a like so I know these stories matter to you. Your support means more than you can imagine, and it helps me keep sharing pieces of life that aren't always easy, but are always real.